Okay, it's a minute until we start. While we're waiting for the audience to trickle in, let me quickly introduce everybody. So today we have Kunal Mangal, who recently completed his PhD at Harvard University and is now a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University. Kunal is presenting one of the chapters from his dissertation. Am I right, Kunal?
Yeah.
And also your job market paper, or a version of it. Called Competitive Exams for Government Jobs and the Labor Supply of College Graduates in India. This is about a hiring freeze, a partial hiring freeze that took place in Tamil Nadu with respect to public sector employment. And it's a really, really interesting paper. Discussing this paper today, we have Christina Brown. Christina also completed her PhD from UC Berkeley and is now a senior fellow at the Friedman Institute and will then go on to start a position as an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Econ Department. Kunal and Christina, it's such a pleasure to have both of you here today. Along with the two of you, we have Mahesh Vyas from CMIE. Mahesh is the MD and CEO of CMIE, and Mahesh is also the person that is the principal architect behind the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. Most of the people coming to this seminar probably know me. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. I work at CMIE along with Mahesh and many other colleagues to make the record level data from CPHS available to researchers. So thank you all for coming. There are still a couple of people streaming in, so I'll take 10 more seconds to quickly let everybody know that we completed the May to August wave of CPHS on the 31st of August. The record level data was released to subscribers on the 1st of September, so we continue to make sure that the gap between data collection and data release is 1 day. We are going to presenting some interesting stories from the wave that just finished on the 23rd of September, which is 2 Thursdays away. Please join us for that. If you want more details, it's on our website. We've got some really great talks that are going to happen in October as well. But I don't want to eat into Kunal's time anymore. So Kunal, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much for agreeing to present. Audience, you can type questions in the Q&A box. And once Kunal and Christina are both done, Kunal will come back and answer your questions.
Okay. Thank you all for being here, for whoever is joining, and I want to thank CMIE for hosting me today. This is a great opportunity to share my work with the broader audience and talk about an issue I think that's that I think is very salient in the Indian labor market. So, by way of motivation, this paper is about the system of exams that India and many other countries use to recruit people for government jobs. I'm sure that many of you are already aware of these exams, in part because they occupy such a large space in the public imagination in India. For many people, government jobs are seen as a unique opportunity to substantially improve your standards of living and earn respect in your community. And so it's not surprising then to see that the selection exams are typically heavily oversubscribed. So in a typical exam, you might see 100 or several hundred applications for each vacancy that's released. The competition is intense enough that it's not uncommon to see people dedicating a significant portion of their 20s preparing for these exams full time. So much so that the full-time exam preparation might last 2, 3, even 10 years. And so, given that this is the situation on the ground, this has led to some concern, particularly in the policy community, that there's unintended consequences of the exam system, and that the prospect of a lucrative government job is encouraging people to give up productive activity and spend their time doing something unproductive like preparing for the selection exam. Now, of course, whether these selection exams do actually affect the broader economy remains an open question. And this paper is going to be a first attempt at trying to provide some empirical evidence to assess this claim. So what do I do? In there's many possible ways in which government selection exams can affect the labor market more broadly. But in this paper, I'm going to focus on two aspects of this larger question. First, I want to look at whether labor supply is in fact responsive to recruitment policy. Right? So if people are really choosing to stay employed because of these jobs, then we should see that the number of unemployed people responds or changes when the value of exam preparation also changes. Whether that's the case is not obvious because it's not clear which way causality goes here. Of course, it could be the case that people choose to be unemployed because they want to apply. But it's also possible that people are applying because they're unemployed, which is to say that the labor market is so slack or there's just so few jobs available that people are kind of stuck in the situation where they just have to apply to whatever is available. Right? And so both of these narratives exist out there in the world. And what I'm going to try to do is to provide some evidence to sort these two out. The second question I'm looking at is related to understanding how to assess the time spent preparing for the exam in economic terms. Right? So one way to think about it is that it's a cost, right? It's something that people bear in order to get selected. But another way of thinking about it is that it's actually an investment, right? After all, they're studying a lot of the same material that you see in school and college syllabi. And so it's not unreasonable to think that candidates who are preparing for the exam are actually building human capital in the process, which might then translate into, let's say, higher earnings in the labor market. And so part of what I want to do in the second part of the paper is get a sense for which of these stories seems to apply more in this setting. So how do I get a handle on these questions? I'm going to look at a rather unique episode in Indian administrative history in which the state of Tamil Nadu between 2001 and 2006 implemented a partial hiring freeze. Now, of course, states, change the number of vacancies available all the time. But what makes this episode rather unique is that the government actually announced its intentions. In 2001, it announced that it was going to suspend hiring for a set of posts for a particular, for an indefinite period of time. And the announcement that they were going to suspend posts allows for the possibility that we see a coordinated response among candidates, which is therefore something that we can more easily detect. The hiring freeze wasn't general across the whole state, right? So by partial hiring freeze, I mean that there was a number of sectors in the government that were effectively exempted from the freeze. And the sectors that remained that were effectively the civil service, which also happens to be the most prestigious and sought after post at the state government level. In those affected sectors, the number of vacancies fell by about 86%. And so for candidates that were studying for those jobs or anticipated studying for those jobs, you see a sharp shock to the value of exam preparation. But because these vacancies are small relative to the size of the labor market as a whole, the total number of jobs available in the labor market is effectively remains the same. Right? So I'm thinking about this shock as something that essentially keeps labor demand intact, but affects one particular sector very sharply, and seeing how people change. And then I want to look at how people change their labor supply in response. Now, to understand or to make sense of what happened during the hiring freeze, I'm going to use data from a wide array of sources. So I'm going to look at, I'm going to use household surveys, I'm going to use government reports, and I'm going to use some administrative data from the government to try to get a sense of what's going on. To understand this impact, I'm going to use a difference in differences strategy that's going to use two axes of variation. I'm going to compare across states, and I'm going to compare affected versus unaffected cohorts. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that more precisely in a bit. One of the weaknesses of this empirical strategy is that I'm going to rely on this parallel trends assumption. right? Which is to say that in the absence of the freeze, we would expect cohorts to evolve along similar paths in Tamil Nadu and in the comparison states. That doesn't seem to be the case for women in this setting. We seem to see a differential trend towards, increased college enrollment and increased labor force participation in Tamil Nadu relative to the rest of India. And one reason that might be happening might have to do with the expansion of, labor market opportunities that happened around the early 2000s related to outsourcing, the BPO movement in IT, in which Tamil Nadu was an early adopter. Nevertheless, I won't, be able to say much about, why that, differential trend is happening. That's just kind of one possible reason. But, one thing you should keep in mind going forward is that one of the weaknesses of this paper is I'm not going to be able to say what's happening in this population. Everything I'm going to say is going to apply to men. So what do I find? First, you might think that if the value of exam preparation goes down, then people might respond by either suspending their exam preparation or dropping out entirely and then taking up a job in the private sector instead. That's not what I see. Instead, I see something that looks like the opposite. The men who are studying for these exams appear to be studying for a longer period of time, not less. If I follow these affected cohorts about a decade later, I see impacts both on the economic margin as well as the social margin. So economically, it looks like they shift from higher paying occupations to lower paying occupations. And even though I can't measure the impact on wages precisely, it looks more likely that they're worse off than that they're shifting into something like some comparative advantage. On the social side, we see a range of impacts that are consistent with affected cohorts attaining lower social status, which is to say that they're less likely to marry, more likely to remain at home with their parents, and they contribute a lower share of household income. And both of these types of results are consistent with what has been found in ethnographic work on people preparing for competitive exams, where the social costs of being unable to form one's own household weigh perhaps just as large as the economic costs of this setting. Now, one of the puzzles in this story that's inherent in this story is that even if people wanted to continue preparing for exams, it's not clear why they didn't just delay that exam preparation until after the hiring freeze ended. One way to make sense of what's going on here is I use data from the recruitment agency to get a sense of the incentives that candidates face to prepare for exams. And what I find is some suggested evidence that the returns for exam preparation are convex in this setting, which means that the more you study, the more you increase the probability of selection. And so, or the probability of selection increases at an increasing rate, which means, in other words, that candidates who choose to prepare early have a chance of essentially outrunning those who choose to prepare later. And that leads to a prisoner's dilemma type dynamic in which candidates are kind of forced to prepare continuously if they want to maintain a decent shot of getting selected. Now that you have a kind of sense of the overall story and where it's going, I'm going to now essentially fill in the details and present my evidence. So first, let me talk a little bit more about kind of the setting and what the hiring freeze entailed. So I'm looking at a set of, so there's a couple things you need to know about the system of merit-based exams that's relevant to the empirical strategy. So first is that there's many different agencies within the government that conduct these exams, both at the state and at the central level, and these operate more or less independently. So when we see a change in recruitment policy in Tamil Nadu, we see, we have a setting in which you can think of that policy as an independent change from what's going on in the rest of the country. The second thing to know is that Tamil Nadu is relatively isolated in terms of applications for government jobs from the rest of the country, because one of the requirements is knowing Tamil, and that's a fairly high barrier to entry for people from other states. So we shouldn't therefore expect much leakage of this policy change into other states. For those who aren't aware of the recruitment process, basically the way a standard notification works across all these recruitment agencies is that first the government publishes a notification, which essentially lists the different posts and the timeline for conducting the exam. There's an application process in which people then apply for that particular notification. People take exams, and then because they're recruiting for a batch of vacancies at once, they assign candidates to the vacancies by their rank and by several other criteria like reservation category and so on. So this process is kind of this process is something to keep in mind when we think about the empirics of understanding how application behavior changes during the hiring phase. Now, a couple of features to note about the hiring freeze itself. First is that the duration of the freeze was uncertain when it was announced. So candidates knew that there weren't going to be vacancies for the foreseeable future, but they didn't know how long. The cause of the hiring freeze appears to be deteriorating state finances, which was spurred by a pay increase that was made in the late 90s that was more expensive than anticipated. So one of the ways the government attempted to mitigate this problem is by reducing hiring in subsequent years. As I mentioned before, not all of the posts within the government were affected. So police, teachers, and doctors, all of which are recruited through exams, were still remained unaffected. And so what we're looking at is essentially this set of civil service posts. And those posts are recruited exclusively by an agency known as the Tamil Nadu Public Service Commission. And so I'm going to be relying a lot on TNPSC data to make sense of what happened. One of the axes of variation that I'm going to use is variation in eligibility, where people with less than a 10th standard education are ineligible to apply for these jobs. And so therefore they should be relatively unaffected. This graph here shows the change in the number of vacancies published in the sectors that were impacted by the hiring freeze. Note that the y-axis is on a log scale. So, the variation we see before the hiring freeze is, quite substantial, from below 1,000 to over 4,000. Nonetheless, you see a marked decline in the number of available vacancies during the freeze, which then rebounds afterwards. But notably, it doesn't go to zero. So there were some exceptions that were made to the hiring freeze. And those exceptions will help us understand kind of what happened during the freeze itself. Now I'm going to switch over to trying to look at what happened, trying to make sense of what happened in the short run to candidates' labor supply. And to do that, I'm going to use data from the National Sample Survey, which is a nationally representative household survey published by the government. And I'm going to stack all waves between 1994 and 2008 that have a module on employment status. So that's going to give me a set of repeated cross sections. My main outcome of interest is employment status, which I measure using 3 binary indicators for whether you're either unemployed, employed, or out of the labor force. Each of these are measured using the NSS's usual status definition, which effectively means, the answer to the question, what were you doing for most of the past year? In this context, if people are studying more for the exam, that might show up either in unemployment or in being out of the labor force. In part because people who study for government exams are known to enroll themselves in postgraduate programs, which provide them time and space in order to study full-time for the exam. So it's ambiguous which direction people might go, but there would definitely be a movement out of employment if you're studying full time. So in order to to measure the impact, I'm going to zoom in on the individuals within Tamil Nadu who are most likely to be affected. Now, I don't have data on application rates from before the hiring freeze, but I can use data from more recent data in order to get a sense of how application rates vary by demographic characteristics. And there's two features that jump out from this graph. First, we see that application rates are much higher for college graduates relative to those who aren't, so high school graduates. And so therefore, I'm going to focus my analysis on college graduates here, simply for the sake of statistical power. I'm then going to look at the other thing we see in this graph is that application rates are much higher for younger cohorts than for older cohorts. And so therefore, I'm going to zoom in on people who are younger, essentially those who were close to the time of graduation at the time of the hiring freeze. So this table summarizes the variation across cohorts that I use in my empirical strategy. Right? So on the right-hand side, we have the set of reference or control comparison cohorts. Right? So these are people who shouldn't be affected by the hiring freeze. And that's because all their outcomes were measured before the hiring freeze was implemented. On the left-hand side, this post-2001 column, these are the set of people who could potentially be affected by the hiring freeze. And I divide them into two groups. The group in orange is the set of people who are expected to graduate from college during the hiring freeze based on their age. So a typical undergraduate degree in India is 3 years, right? So we would typically expect people to graduate and enter the labor force at age 21. And so based on that, looking across the 5 years of the freeze, these are the ages of the people who are expected to graduate during the freeze. And given that the underlying latent application rate is higher for these groups, they should potentially be more affected. There's a second set of people who could be affected, which is the cohorts that had graduated before the hiring freeze was implemented. And here you have essentially a set of people, some of whom may have already dropped out from exam preparation, but who nevertheless do have a substantial share of people preparing for exams, and they could potentially be affected as well, though we would expect the impact to be more muted here. I formulate these comparisons in this difference in difference regression. The main coefficients of interest here are beta 1 and beta 2. The controls are generally standard. I also include a set of controls for the sampled individual's current age interacted with Tamil Nadu. And what that's effectively doing is controlling for kind of the average trend or the average trajectory that candidates follow as they age within cohorts over time. Now, I cluster my standard errors here at the state by cohort level. And because I have only 5 clusters for each of the beta 1 or beta 2 coefficients, I'm going to use a wild bootstrap procedure to get correct coverage of those confidence intervals. This table effectively summarizes the main result on labor supply. What I see in the first row, the row that's highlighted in the red box, we're looking at the set of people with the high baseline application rates. In this group, we see a 9.5 percentage point decline in the probability of employment in this set of cohorts. The drop in employment is made up for in about equal measure by changes in unemployment and changes in an increase in being out of the labor force. I'm not showing it in this column here, but this increase in being out of the labor force is almost entirely accounted for. Is entirely accounted for by increases in postgraduate enrollment, and so the types of shifts that we see here are in line essentially with the types of shifts we would see if people are spending more time preparing for the exams. In the second row, we're looking at the set of people who were expected to graduate before the hiring freeze, where the impacts would be more muted, and that's indeed what we see. The coefficients are all smaller in magnitude, and given the variation in the data, I can't really, none of the coefficients are statistically significant. Now, there's a couple questions you might have about this table. One is whether the impacts that we're looking at are actually real. What I do a number of robustness checks in the paper, and it turns out that these estimates aren't that sensitive to either the choice of comparison cohorts or the choice of comparison states. You can take 10 states sampled at random from the set of available states, and you get on average impacts similar to what I'm showing you here. Now, the other potentially more worrying concern is whether, whether I'm looking at something like labor, whether I'm looking at labor supply or whether I'm looking at a labor demand effect. And there's a couple of things I do here to try to tease apart these different interpretations. So first, I use the fact that there's a set of people who are eligible to apply, and I look at the impacts on them. I see almost nothing. And so, in other states of India outside of Tamil Nadu, we see that the employment rates of ineligible and eligible individuals is decently correlated. And so this test should be somewhat informative in that regard. The second test that I do is I look at, well, the hiring freeze lasted for a specific period of time. If we look at the same set of cohorts after the hiring freeze ended, do we see any impacts there? And the answer is no, either. No there too, which suggests that we're not looking at some kind of fixed characteristics of cohorts and make them more employable, more or less employable, or less able to compete in the labor market. Lastly, and perhaps more convincingly, I look at what happens to wages. And so if the change in employment is really an effect of labor demand, then we should expect to see earnings fall on average during the hiring freeze. But in fact, I see I see the opposite. Wages on average go up, and that doesn't appear to be driven by positive selection into the labor force. And so put together, these results suggest that there's a downward shift in labor supply among college-educated graduates which is driven by the hiring freeze itself. Now, to what extent does labor supply tell us about exam preparation? To try to get a sense of what's going, whether candidates are actually preparing more, I look specifically at what happens to applications. And if candidates stop preparing for the exam, we should expect applications to fall. And if candidates then, are more likely to apply, then we should see applications go up. There were 9 exceptions in the impacted sectors that were made during the hiring freeze. And so I look specifically at the set of posts with the same post name, both before, during, and after the hiring freeze. And I run a Poisson regression model in which I control specifically for the post name fixed effect. So I'm essentially comparing within a given post, how do applications change over time. This table summarizes the impact on applications. I'm going to start with the second column first. So by controlling for the number of vacancies in the post name, I'm effectively looking at change in an application rate. I'm saying conditional on having the same post and the same number of vacancies, how does the propensity to apply change across time? And what we see is a marked increase in the propensity to apply during the hiring freeze, and not so much after the hiring freeze. There seems to be the same underlying propensity to apply. Now, there's 2 opposing forces when we think about the total number of applications. On the one hand, this propensity to apply is increased, but on the other hand, the number of vacancies has gone down, which we see in this column is correlated with the number of applications. So the first column essentially provides the net result of these 2 forces. And what we see is that there's an increase in applications during the hiring freeze of about 7.3%. But given the wide variation in applications before the freeze, I can't really estimate that effect precisely. You know, nonetheless, you know, one reason to think that it's real is that it's consistent with our, you know, what we might expect given the changes in employment rates, right? So we saw about a 9.5 percentage point drop, right? And assuming that things in the remaining populations move somewhat proportionally, you would expect something on the order of about a 7 to 9, 10% change in applications during the hiring freeze. And so, you know, even though I can't really tell that story directly, the data are not inconsistent with the story either. Now, what does it mean for application rates to go up? My best guess is that candidates are studying longer. And the conclusion rests essentially on a revealed preference argument in which, you know, if you're somebody who wasn't intending to apply for these jobs already, it doesn't make sense that you would want to do so when the number of vacancies have gone down, when the value of doing so has just become worse. So instead, you know, the way to make up the difference is to essentially say that there's, you know, a certain amount of time that people stay on the exam track, and if they had to trit at a slower rate, then you would see an increase in the number of applications. Of course, even if you're attriting at a slower rate, you know, it's still possible that you do some kind of employment on the side in order to support yourself while you're waiting for exams. But the impacts that we see on employment suggest that this is not a first order effect. That on average, what we're seeing is that something that looks like full-time exam preparation during the hiring freeze. Now, what does this mean in the long term? If people are preparing for the exam full time, you know, it could be the case that part of the reason they do so is just because it's pretty costless, and that's what makes it pretty easy for them to do that. And so in this section, I'm going to use this CPHS data to delve into what happens in the longer run. The CPHS is a national sample of about 160,000 households, and I'm going to use all the pre-corona waves from 2014 to 2019. These waves correspond to around 8 to 13 years after the end of the hiring freeze. And so for shorthand, I'd say about a decade after the hiring. The outcomes that I'm going to look at are informed by some of the prior ethnographic work in this area that stresses both a set of economic consequences as well as social consequences. And so I'm going to use a range of different indicators to try to get at both economic and social well-being. And I'll explain how they kind of link to those broader concepts as I go along. These, my outcome variables are going to be measured at different frequencies, and that's going to essentially be determined by both the frequency at which they're measured in CPHS and whether I think that there's something that's essentially time varying or not, right? So for example, your marital status or living with parents, and, you know, in principle, you know, you could get married or whatever, yeah, over time. But I'm looking at a set of people who are essentially like post-30, in their 30s and 40s. And so I'm going to focus essentially on, I'm going to treat some of these outcomes as a static. And that's summarized in this table. You know, CPHS is a different data set than the NSS, and so I'm going to have to adapt my empirical strategy. And one of these main adaptations, I'm going to have to use a different control group, essentially, a different set of control cohorts. And that's due to the fact that in the NSS, I was able to observe cohorts before the hiring freeze, but I don't have a comparable, you know, something comparable here. I'm observing everyone after the hiring freeze. And so instead, I'm going to make use of the fact that the effects appear to be much smaller and more muted as you look at older cohorts. So I'm going to use a set of, you know, substantially older cohorts who had graduated from, were expected to have graduated from college much before the hiring freeze, and I'm going to use them as the comparison group in this setting. I implement a difference in different strategy. You know, most of it stays the same, including I'm looking at the same set of comparison states and I'm looking at the same set of cohorts. One thing to remark on is that I'm including this, one might worry given the panel nature that there might be endogenous attrition here, which is to say that people who had good outcomes, for example, might be more willing to continue to talk to surveys over time, and people who, let's say, had bad outcomes would want to, let's say, shun the surveyor and not want to keep on following up and reveal their state. So to address this, this potential issue, I'm including a set of fixed effects at the first wave by current wave level, which means I'm comparing a set of people who both entered the sample at the same time and are being surveyed, the same number of waves later from their first entry. And so all of my comparisons are going to be between cohorts within those groups. As before, I have a small number of clusters at the state by cohort level, and so I'm going to use the wild bootstrap again. The first column here it looks at the impact of the same set of cohorts that we saw that were impacted in the short run. And what we see is this marked decline in people reporting having some kind of business occupation and a shift towards farming, daily wage labor, and some other kind of non-white collar employment. CMIE reports about 20 different occupation categories, but here I've kind of collapsed it into six different groups. Now, similar to this pattern that we saw in the previous section, we see these more muted, smaller responses in the set of cohorts that graduated before the hiring freeze. What does this mean for income? In this graph, what I'm doing is I'm plotting the estimated effects from the previous slide on the y-axis for the main impacted cohorts. And on the x-axis, I'm using the average occupational income for that occupation in the comparison states for the comparison cohorts. And so what we see is a systematic movement from high income occupations to low income occupations, from business mostly towards these other categories. And just based on the occupational shifts alone, you would expect a movement of about a drop in income of about 5%. Now I try to measure this impact directly in the paper, but the effect is the estimated effect is close to zero with a wide standard error. This might be, of course, partly due to the fact that income is a very noisy measure, and something, an effect on the order of 5% might be hard to detect in the setting. But the other indicators that we represent suggest that this kind of shift is not really a case of somehow people taking advantage of these other occupations better, but rather kind of a downgrade of employment opportunities. Even though we see this drop in employment opportunities, we don't detect a measurable impact on household economic well-being. Though again, the standard errors are wide here. Part of the reason we might not see an effect on household well-being is that we see these other compensating measures in household labor supply. So the affected cohorts, the set of people that are expected to graduate during the freeze, tend to live in households with more earning members of the household. These other earning members tend to be mostly exclusively male, and their age ranges are spread out, but they tend to be kind of around the same age as the people who are affected by the freeze, which is to say that the people who were between 17 to 26 in 2001 are about 30 to 55 in the time period that I'm looking at after the hiring freeze. The impact on people who are older than the affected cohorts in this last column is suggestive of, though not dispositive, of people who are elder in the family essentially delaying retirement in order to continue to support the economic well-being of the household. Now, the next thing I do is that I look at a number of indicators that are related to the potential social costs that that candidates might bear. And in this context, markers of social status, and an important marker of social status is being able to form your own household and being able to run your own household. And here we see delays on both of those markers. So in the first column, we see that the affected cohorts, they contribute less to household income overall. In the second column, I look at whether they're considered the head of household in their household, and this is something that's assigned by the surveyor, not the respondent themselves. And so this is noisy, but it goes in the same direction. They're also again less likely to be married, and more likely to be living with a guardian, which is either a parent or a grandparent. And all of these coefficients together suggest that these affected cohorts aren't able to really they aren't able to kind of move beyond or achieve a kind of certain marker of household formation that's valuable and important in this setting. So Craig Jeffrey, who's the ethnographer that I'm referring to repeatedly here, the way he summarizes this is that the failure to acquire secured salary work not only jeopardized young men's social and economic standing, but also threatened their ability to marry and thereby fulfill locally valued norms of adult masculinity. So the two phrases that I've highlighted in bold are the parts that I feel correspond, which is some of the evidence that I presented here, where on the one hand we see these shifts in occupations, kind of away from something that looks more secure to something that looks less secure, and a movement away, and these delays in household formation that have their own costs. Okay, so in the remaining time, what I'm going to do is try to get a sense of try to unpack the behavior that rationalizes these findings in more detail. There's two questions that naturally arise. One is, why would candidates be willing to spend more time rather than less? And then the second question is, why don't candidates find a job while they're waiting for the hiring freeze to end? On the first one, I'm not going to really be able to say much directly. And that's because the answer is going to depend, the precise mechanism is going to depend on the beliefs that candidates hold at the time of the freeze. But here I'm going to sketch out a couple possible mechanisms, just, that could be consistent with the story. One possibility is that the hiring freeze prevented, is that candidates learn about their probability of success from taking the exam and from their scores once they and from the feedback from their scores. And if the hiring freeze prevented learning about your ability and your performance, then over-optimistic beliefs might have persisted longer than they otherwise would. So the idea is that if exams are being conducted regularly, people would realize that they're not going to make it and eventually drop out. Whereas if exams aren't being conducted, you might still persist in the belief that you have a chance. Now, another possible mechanism, which is also entirely plausible, is that candidates might rationally expect that if vacancies are going down, then the government will feel the need to compensate with more vacancies in the future, and that would also increase the value of exam preparation in the future. Now, leaving aside the specific mechanism, both of these mechanisms, even if the value of exams goes up in the future, there still is a question of why you don't just wait until those future exams in order to start studying. And this is where we're going to look at where I'm going to use application and test score data in order to try to get a sense of the kind of incentives that candidates face when they're preparing for exams, to try to understand why there's this incentive to prepare continuously. So the logic is something like, a prisoner's dilemma, where imagine you have two candidates of somewhat equal ability, neither of whom wants to study, but you're willing to defect or deviate by studying in order to gain an advantage. Right? If the value of doing so depends on the returns from studying, if the returns are concave, then eventually the returns to that deviation are going to peter out. But if the returns are convex, then you can keep on playing that game, and there'll be this rat race effect where people will keep on pushing each other to study longer. And so what I'm going to try to do is try to get a sense of whether the returns are actually convex in this setting. And to do so, I'm going to use data from a set of group recruitments, which are essentially the most popular exams that are conducted by TNPSC in the impacted sectors. And these account for essentially 80% of vacancies and more than 90% of applications in the sectors that we care about. I'm going to use data from between 2012 to 2016. And I'm going to observe two features of this application process that are going to be useful in the empirical strategy. First is that I observe the data they provide on the application form, which provides demographic information. And I also observe the answer pattern of each candidate. So I know not just which candidate, the total score for each candidate, but which candidate got which question right. The second thing that I do is I look at is that I can link candidates across time using a combination of their names and date of births and parents' names, and this method, appears to be pretty successful in matching candidates across time. Now, what I'm interested in is estimating this underlying relationship between, on the one hand, whether you're selected, and on the right-hand side, the number of attempts you make, which are used as essentially a proxy of exam preparation and study effort. And if the returns are convex, then we would expect beta 2 to be positive. Now, of course, there's this endogeneity concern and who chooses to stay in the game. And so I'm going to use this IV strategy in which I make use of the fact that candidates base their future reapplication decisions on their past exam scores. So to the extent that's true, right? Application scores contain both, a component of ability and a component of luck. And so if I am able to extract that component of luck to some extent, then I can essentially get an instrument for the number of attempts that candidates make. In the interest of time, I'm going to quickly skip this. What I do in order to kind of separate the luck from ability is I use these item response theory models, right, in which I make use of the fact that the total number of questions that someone gets right is not, doesn't make full use of the information available on a multiple choice test. And in particular, it might be the case that somebody gets a higher or lower score based on whether they got lucky on particular test questions. And this, theory provides a framework for getting a sense of, to what extent the variation in scores is due to luck versus ability. So what we see on the x-axis here is this estimate of ability using this item response theory method, and we see that there's a substantial variation in the score that candidates obtain conditional on getting having the same estimated ability. That leads to this residual distribution, which I call the score residual, and that's going to essentially provide my instrument. So, when you see a value of something like 20 over here, that means that candidates got 20 more points on the exam than they were expected to get given their ability. This figure essentially plots the first stage of this IV strategy. So what I'm looking at is an indicator variable for whether you reapplied for an exam at time t. I'm going to use as a baseline everybody who applied to a particular exam in 2013, kind of at the beginning of my sample window. And I'm going to restrict attention to people who hadn't really applied before, right? In which case we would think that learning effects would be largest. And so each of these coefficients here represents is the beta coefficient on this residual, where I'm looking at to what extent the residual predicts whether you reapply in the subsequent exam, where, the different exams are kind of plotted based on the distance between when they were conducted and the original baseline exam was conducted. And what we see is that, for the exams that were conducted immediately after the baseline exam, there's this positive effect. But this effect wears off over time, which is consistent with you gaining information from other sources over time, and therefore the luck component being a smaller proportion of your overall decision making as you go forward. And so, to estimate the additional returns to exam preparation, I'm going to use I'm going to look at the set of exams that were conducted in this year after the hiring phase, and I'm going to look at, and I'm going to estimate the returns using a two-stage least square strategy. In the first coefficient, in the first column, I provide the OLS estimates, and in the second column, I provide the IB estimates. And in both cases, we see that that there seems to be this kind of positive quadratic curvature suggesting there's this underlying convexity to the returns to studying in this. So there's so what should we make of this? I think I'd like you to take away a couple of major points. The first is just that there is, I think this research highlights the possibility that hiring policy in a setting like India can move the entire labor market. I think often we think of hiring policy in terms of what happens to the people who are selected, right? Whether they're competent or not, whether they're corrupt or not, whether it's, promoting development or not, and less on the people who, almost millions of people who go through the system every year, but who aren't selected, right? I think what this research is showing is that that's a very important margin. What we see here, changes in occupational status and these long-run effects are reminiscent of the literature on graduating in a recession, but note that, we have a recession just from a couple thousand vacancies, right, in a large labor market, right? And so that suggests that, there's this rich, phenomenon that's going on where, it's not necessarily the size of the shock, but the salience of the shock can also trigger, ripple effects across the economy. Given the current set of institutions and incentives, it looks like delaying recruitment seems to be particularly costly, and this is now relevant in the post-COVID era, given that many state governments are delaying recruitment for understandable reasons, and even before COVID, there have been many governments that have kind of come and gone that have slowed hiring for one reason or the other. And, this research suggests that there may actually be substantial consequences to doing so. Of course, a government, personnel is costly, people are costly. And so, one thing that we may want to think about is ways to kind of decouple recruitment policy from these broader labor market impacts, right? So that you're not effectively, so that you have more margin to work with on personnel policy. And that suggests changes in the types of incentives that candidates face in order to do so. So with that, I'll wrap up my piece, and thank you all for listening, and looking forward to seeing your questions and seeing what Christina has to say.
Thanks a lot, Kunal. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, but let's bring Christina in first. Christina, thank you again for agreeing to be a discussant on this paper. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be able to discuss this paper. This is one of my favorite papers that I read in the last year, so it's really a delight to get to talk through it. Okay. So as Kunal talked through, he's going to be evaluating the effect of a significant decrease in the number of public sector vacancies during the period of 2001 to 2006 in Tamil Nadu. And he's going to exploit the fact that we really think that this policy is going to have really detrimental effects for younger cohorts who are just coming out of college versus ones who are more experienced or already in the labor market and are less likely to be applying for these posts. So exploiting that variation and kind of exposure across cohorts, as well as variation across space, comparing Tamil Nadu to other Indian states, he can use a difference in different strategy. He's also going to have this placebo group being able to compare college graduates versus non-college educated individuals because of the fact that there's these hiring for educational requirements for these particular positions. And what he finds is that the result of this policy is, extremely detrimental for these younger cohorts. There's a significant decrease in employment, about 13% or 9 percentage points, about half of which is unemployment, so people that are completely out of the labor force, and another half which are going into further education. And he kind of proposes that both of these strategies might be used in exam prep. So either people are, have stopped working or are pursuing further education in order to, improve their outcomes on these exams. And then even 10 years later, a decade later after this policy has existed, these cohorts still have, lower outcomes in terms of the types of occupations they're in, and they're less likely to be heads of households. And then one of the, I think, really, really interesting pieces of this paper, I definitely encourage you to, get to the last section because he's able to show that, using the fact that we have lots of rich data that we can use when we have item level response information from these tests, we can actually exploit the fact that there's some luck component and some ability component on these tests. And so then he uses that as an instrument to get at what the returns are to taking this test multiple times, and shows that it could be that these cohorts are actually making kind of they're optimally approaching this test taking strategy because there are these large returns to taking the test multiple times. And so for these groups that only were, having the test offered, once or twice a year, it made sense for them to continue studying over multiple years to wait to take the test multiple times. I want to just take a step back and say that I think that this topic in particular is just extremely important. I think that what we're seeing now in terms of unemployment for young individuals in developing countries, especially amongst young college-educated individuals, is really at astronomical levels. So in most developing countries, unemployment rates for youth are somewhere between 2 or 3 times higher than their peers in their 30s and 40s. And this is, extremely important because of the negative implications for these unemployed individuals, as Kunal was kind of pointing out, that there's kind of long-term scarring that can happen in terms of consumption and income in the long run to being unemployed in your youth. But there's also bigger social consequences of youth unemployment in terms of crime and violence and kind of social formation in terms of marriage and other things. And so this is, a super, super important social question that I'm glad we're studying. And I think in particular, this transition from school to work, trying to understand how people go about finding their first job or choosing what sector to go into coming out of college is a really important question that we don't have a lot of great evidence on, especially in developing countries. The other thing I want to kind of flag that I think Kunal didn't sell enough from this paper is that, the effects of this policy are just astronomical. These are really, really enormous effects that he's finding. So, the reduction in just 600 postings over this period results in 9,000 additional individuals out of the labor force for a 5-year period. So these are really, really enormous effects. And if we're to compare them to, what we would typically see if there was, closing of a factory or some other shock where there was a reduction in jobs, the most kind of conservative elasticities you might expect is that maybe 500 people would be unemployed initially, and then there would be, kind of negligible effects of that reduction of jobs over time. And so the fact that we see, a decade later impacts of a small reduction of jobs suggests that this is, extremely important to the labor market more generally. And what I love that Kunal is able to highlight is that it's really not just about the destruction of the job, but it's about the destruction of opportunities to take this exam. So during this period, we go from a time where there was, on average, maybe 3 of these exams being offered per month to during this period, there's about 1 exam every 7 months. So the opportunities for individuals to take the exam, learn about their odds, learn from the test taking process is just going to be much, much longer now, rather than them studying for 6 months and getting to take the exam a couple times. It's taking them 2 years to be able to get that experience and learning. And so you end up just getting much, much longer spells of unemployment as a result of this. And so I think that that's a really nice contribution of this paper, is understanding that really this policy is this kind of twofold piece. There's the reduction in the actual number of vacancies, but also the reduction in the opportunities for test taking, which seems to be kind of the mechanism that's really driving these detrimental long-term effects. One thing I want to highlight, just in terms of kind of thinking about the kind of external validity and some of the takeaways from the paper too, is that one thing that would be helpful to understand a little bit more, and Kunal, you might have some thoughts on this too, is a little bit more about what was kind of happening simultaneously in this time period. Because there was this kind of shock to the state budget, we might imagine that while teachers and doctor postings stayed the same, maybe there was just less overall government spending. And so that resulted in fewer private sector jobs. Maybe there's kind of shocks to other parts of how spending is happening. And that could kind of have add-on effects to other parts of the labor market. So it'd be great to kind of hear your thoughts about what is happening to other parts of the state budget during this time. The other thing I'm curious about too is that there's any interaction with female labor force participation. As you mentioned, it doesn't look like there's parallel trends for females during this period of time. And so I'd be curious if there's any interaction too in terms of kind of more women joining the labor force in Tamil Nadu during this period. It sounded like it was a particular sector that was kind of more female focused, but if this might have any effect in terms of just more women entering the labor force and pushing out opportunities for males during this period, if that could explain any of the increased unemployment during this period for men. The other thing too is because we're working with, there aren't that many kind of units of observation in this setting, we are going to have pretty wide confidence intervals. And so, the effects of this policy seem like they're quite enormous, but, we can't rule out somewhere between, 2,000 to up to 17,000 individuals reduced from employment during this period. And so I think having maybe data at district level, or if there's any smaller unit of observation, it would be great to be able to see this done again, because I think that this is super interesting policy to be able to kind of really nail down what the effects are. It's really useful. And then I'd love your thoughts too. I don't know if you've seen any of the recent work on kind of difference in difference approaches. I know that there's been a lot of work recently on trying to understand kind of what are the additional robustness assumptions we want to take into account. So if you have any thoughts on kind of, whether this holds up to those additional tests, I'd love to get your thoughts. And then I think, kind of taking a step back from this for future work, hopefully, for yourself or for others who are interested in this area, I think the kind of key insight from this paper is that, getting opportunities to learn about your prospects seems to be extremely important. And so really understanding how do new graduates' beliefs about their opportunities, their likelihood of success, how does that evolution of learning take place as they apply for jobs or take these tests more generally? So not just for people who are interested in these particular public sector jobs, but just for new graduates in general, when they're learning about the labor market and their place in the labor market. I think that that's a super interesting area of study, because that can really help us explain why there seems to be such a long lag of unemployment for a lot of these youth. Understanding if they have the correct beliefs, how do we best update their beliefs potentially? What are the kind of best mechanisms that we can have to improve their transition rates into the labor force? I think is a really exciting area for future study. And I think with using some of the data that you have with the IRT test scores, you might also be able to not only see, how are people making choices about whether or not to retake the test. You might be able to see, for individuals who performed extremely poorly because of this luck component, is there differential kind of updating at different parts of the distribution, right? So for people who had a very negative draw versus a very positive draw, how does that updating function kind of look at different parts of the distribution? I think it would be really interesting to see if there's kind of a threshold. If I get a score that's this low, I choose to kind of give up. Whereas if I'm kind of in the middle, how do I make that decision of whether or not to continue the studying process? I think that would be super interesting to look into, and I think the data exists to do that. So it'd be great. Thank you so much. And wonderful paper. Really great to read.
Thanks, Christina. Kunal, back to you. Would you like to respond to the points that Christina raised, as well as perhaps some of the questions coming into the Q&A?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks again, Christina, for your comments. And so let me address some of the questions that you raised first. You're right that one of the, a lot of this paper relies on this indirect inference, right? I don't really observe who exactly is studying for exams. There's no data set really even, from this time period that links exam preparation and employment status and so on. And so I'm, and I'm looking at this large state level policy shock, right? And so, the upside is that you could potentially look at all sorts of, major general equilibrium changes, but the downside is that you open yourself up to a bunch of other things that are changing at the same time. One thing I haven't added yet in the paper, which is something that I've just kind of learned about and trying to incorporate, is that at the same time, the government still felt a pinch for basically fulfilling its basic functions. And so they started hiring a bunch of people on a contract basis. And so, these people were in kind of temporary, positions that didn't have permanency. And, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's essentially the same order of magnitude as the drop in permanent vacancies, right? So it seems like the government did still make an effort to basically maintain government functioning. But, there's the shift from permanency to impermanency, right? And so that kind of further isolates the type of variation that we care about, right? Which is that these are it's not just any government job that matters, it's the permanent, stable, exam-based job that matters. The interaction with female labor force is an interesting idea. The idea that, let's say, women are kind of pushing men out. I'll have to think about that one a little bit. It's not something I've considered before. If that's the case, that would suggest that just men got destroyed by women in the IT revolution, so that's something that I'll have to think about a little bit more. In terms of difference in difference, I think one of the reasons that this is relatively simple is that I have a single, I don't have any, I have a single treatment group, right? And there's no kind of staggered adoption or differential timing. The main tricky part is that I'm including these Tamil Nadu times age dummy interactions, right? So I'm including these additional controls, and that's not an innocuous assumption. But one of these additional things that I need to add to the paper is essentially that if you do the fully interacted specification in which you, let's say, interact your treatment with all the different age dummies, right, and then take the average across that, you should get essentially the same result, and then that is in fact the case, right? So that suggests that you're not getting something wonky because of these age controls, you're just getting more precision. Now there's some additional comments that I wanted to address from the audience. Nikhil is asking, whether do you have a sense of whether people are right for potentially foregoing employment and preparing for these government jobs? Meaning, like, are government jobs really that valuable? And part of the reason I wanted to bring this question up is that it's a plug for another one of my papers that tries to get at this question, which is to say that it's very hard to assess how much a government job is worth because there's this, amenity component that's this large unobservable, right? So a typical, permanent government job is going to give you lifetime, insurance, and it's going to give you, prestige and social status, and is going to give you, access to, corrupt income, which is, something that I've found that candidates actually talk about and think about. And if you're a man, then, there's also the dowry that comes when you get married, and that's also something that people think about. And so, if you put all of these things together, there's like a, a huge component of, the value of government jobs that's not captured in the wage. It turns out if you look at people's, like how long people spend preparing for exams or how long they expect to prepare, you can't rationalize it at the given wage levels, right? You need to have some amenity component. And in fact, you need to have something that looks like, 81, something like 5 times the value of the nominal wage in the amenity in order to rationalize this behavior. Now, whether that makes sense or not depends on whether what premium you put on insurance and corrupt income and all these things which are hard to assess. But at the very least, that calculation suggests that you would need a large amenity value to rationalize a lot of this behavior. There were also questions on, let me see. Shamim is asking whether the identification of who studies is based solely on an employment status question. And yes, effectively, I'm doing a very indirect inference here, right? Where I'm not observing exam preparation directly per se. I'm piecing together changes in application rates and changes in employment status and kind of background knowledge on what people who are studying for exams do and trying to make a case for, this particular story. Right. But again, I'm not able to observe those people directly, and that's kind of one of the weaknesses of the study. And I'm hoping that in the future there are more data sets that become available that kind of link these phenomena. One way of thinking about this paper is that it's kind of like a smoking gun for like this needs to be looked into further. It's not going to basically nail this down very concretely. There's another question about whether wages rise in the government sector or the private sector. So, the government has a very strict, timeline and, like a fixed schedule for its wages. So the wages aren't going to change in the government per se. In the private sector, what we do see is that people are earning, who stay in the labor market are earning more, which is, consistent with, the supply shock. And that's part of the evidence that, I use, but all the income figures that I use in this paper are going to be deflated. And so I'm looking at real wages and not nominal wages. Driven by I see. So Vastav is making the point that part of the the hiring freeze was driven by this increase in wages of government employees from the the 5th commission pay raise, and did that have any direct effects that we see on, let's say, the in the future, right? So it could be the case that there's a set of parents who are employed by the government and their wages go up, and so they're able to, let's say, fund postgraduate graduate education more easily for their kids as a result. So that is not something I talked about per se. I mean, one way in which that might not hold is that this 5th commission pay raise was happened basically across the country. So almost all the government employees in the state experienced pay raises around the same time, within a couple of years of each other, right? So it's not like this effect is absent in the comparison states, and to the effect that it's there, that should have, canceled out, right? Unless you have to say that people in Tamil Nadu are like, particularly willing to invest in higher education, and not in, let's say, even other South Indian states, and so you would have to tell a particular story. So there's another question here by Shamim about the age limitation. One of the parts I didn't mention here is that in Tamil Nadu, for almost all applicants, there is virtually no age limit. So there's only a specific set of exams, and that to specific reservation categories in which these age limits typically apply. And so in a lot of cases, they're just not binding, or not, they don't exist. That's something that's just particular about this state. Most states have these age limits. Though it's interesting to note that even though there's a lot of political fear around these age limits, in practice, very few people are actually studying at the age limit, at least from the data that I've seen so far, right? So there are people who might be affected, but you still see that pattern of declining application rates with age, and which suggests that there would still be nominal impacts at the top of the age distribution. And then there's this question on this luck versus ability component. So yeah, I sped through this part, and basically the way to think about it is that not all questions on an exam are created equally, right? So some questions involve a lot of luck, and some will involve more skill. What does it mean for a question to involve luck? One way of assessing that is that if your probability of answering that question isn't really correlated with the number of responses you get correct on the other questions, then that suggests that that question is essentially more of a game of chance. Whereas if your propensity to answer correctly is very correlated with your answers on other questions, then that suggests that it's more about ability, right? And so the model essentially provides a structure for thinking about these two different components. And so even though I'm not able to, let's say, so the distinction between luck and ability is basically made in probabilistic terms, right? As what you say is that you can estimate a probability of answering each question correctly, and then you can look at whether your total score is either higher or lower than your expected outcomes. And that's kind of what I mean by luck versus ability in this question. So I think I've answered most of the main questions here. I guess I'll open it up to either Mahesh or Kaushik, I guess, depending on where you want to take this up.
Thanks, Kunal. That was great. And thank you, Christina, as well, for your comments. I just wanted to say a couple of words because we're getting close to the end of the session. But like Christina said, and Kunal, as your paper demonstrates, it's so important for us to understand what's happening to young people that are entering the labor force, and what are the impediments to them being kind of absorbed into the labor force, into productive jobs that can pay them well. And I think using the government hiring freeze was kind of a very interesting way to try and get at one part of this puzzle. My thoughts, and forgive me because all of them are coming just from the lens of the survey, because that's all I do now and that's all I think about, is I feel like there is so much that's waiting to be explored along these lines, and we're delighted to see more research from you and from others on this. One thing I think that really makes this so interesting is the fact that it's not just a household survey, but it's also a panel survey, right? So you're seeing these people over time, and you see them as they get to the age when they're going to enter the labor force. There are all these different shocks. Some of them are nationwide, some of them are just region specific, that are going to kind of bring in some kind of impediment when it comes to their being able to enter into the labor market. And then you can see what happens to these people, right? So you use that to great effect in charting out the long-term trajectories of the people that were affected by the government hiring freeze. To me, it would be a different research question, but I still think a really interesting research question to go after young people in general as they're entering the labor force and see what happens to them, even just descriptively, right? Like some of the things that Christina was saying, what are the kinds of jobs people are either selecting into or getting assigned into by the labor market when they enter the labor force? And how well does it match against what they're getting trained to do? So we capture all of this information on discipline of study as well, right? So you can see whether people who are training to be engineers are actually getting jobs that are in that part of the labor market, or whether they're going and working in retail or something else. So, I think there's an interesting set of questions that you can use, that you can try to answer there. You said that you were really interested in non-wage benefits of government jobs. Again, I think that's a really interesting topic, right? Because as you said, the de facto wages that government sector people earn are relatively not that high. And so what is it that's so attractive about these jobs? And you had mentioned, what happens on dowries and things like that. Again, what makes CPHS nice is, given that it's a household survey, you also see when marriages take place, and we capture information on household amenities, right? So you can't say how much do you earn in dowry, because nobody's going to answer that question, and we don't ask that question. But we do know what assets the household has. So suppose there's somebody who has a government job, gets married, and you see the marriage event take place inside the household, and happening to the list of assets in that household. No, there are interesting ways to try and get at some of these questions. So I'm just not on the paper directly, but throwing out a couple of possibilities that the data makes available to you. I'll say one last thing and hand it over to Mahesh, just from what's possible with the data perspective. Some of the people here know this, I'm not, but some of them may not. Even for people who are not employed, CPHS asks them about their occupation. And Mahesh, you should come in here and weigh in on this. But one way to think about it is, what would your occupation be if you were actually employed in the labor market? And that could again be another nice way to look at these questions of, how appropriate is the match, even conditional employment for a lot of young people. If it's a very tight labor market, it's possible that people are just getting allocated wherever there's space in the market. And that might be one way to look at it, just taking advantage of the time series nature. But I'll stop here. Mahesh, I know you write and think a lot about the labor force, and in particular about young people as they join the labor force. Would you like to add anything to this? And then I'll just turn it back to Christina and Kunal to say a couple of words and end the session today.
Thanks, Kaushik. Kunal, really wonderful paper. I enjoyed going through it earlier and enjoyed your presentation a lot more. So congratulations, it's a great paper. And broader perspective that Christina brought in as well. So that perspective of a larger scale added more dimension. And of course, you gave good ideas for Kunal's paper as well. So excellent. Yeah, I do kind of write more op-ed kind of pieces, more descriptive kind of pieces on employment and about labor coming in, looking for jobs and so on and so forth. So I think what has been missed in this session, before I come to what I write, is what I saw in the paper and what Kunal came and met me about many years ago when the paper was still in the making, is a problem that he found in the database. And it was really a very nice problem. He has not discussed it in the presentation today, but it is there in the paper as an appendix. It's a very nice piece, and he not only identifies a problem, but even gives a solution around it. To say, how, when there is noise in the age series of members, what do you do to correct for that? So he observes, for example, that the age series of members is quite disciplined till 2016, right, Kunal? And then it gets noisy. Kind of finds a way of overcoming that noise. So it's a very interesting approach. I quite liked it. And I would recommend other people who use age to also kind of adopt that approach maybe even improvise on that. So it's a good beginning that Kunal has done. So I think that's one thing which was important as an aside, not the main findings, but I think it's a very useful piece. So I must compliment you on that. Just to add to this, I have written a piece to explain on the same topic, Kunal, a piece which will come out on how we do it in a week or so. So addressing exactly the same problem of the noise in age after 2016. So we have addressed the problem that you highlighted to me many years ago. Thanks a lot for that.
You're welcome.
That's all that I have to add to this, which I think is relevant to the work that Kunal has done.
Okay, fair enough, Mahesh. And I'm glad you're saying this because I wasn't sure whether to compliment Kunal on this. But Kunal, again, we look at this as the producers of the data coming out of this survey and how we can also improve in the data collection, what we can learn from users and researchers. I think one thing that this seminar series does really well, and which you've done a great job of doing today, is just giving ideas to people who are also potential researchers and users of the data on what can be done with it. I think this is another point which often doesn't come up in these seminars, and I'm glad that Mahesh brought it up, which is you wrote, and I think you investigate the data so thoroughly on age, and that's helped us in our own thinking and in our own documentation. So that's going to come out, as Mahesh said. Mahesh, did you say later this week or in a couple of weeks? I forgot.
Well, in about a week. In about a week.
In about a week. And we'll be, and I think that documentation is really rich, and I hope it helps you with your research and helps others with their research as well. We'll be talking about it next month in October, in fact. So we'll invite you then, and you should tell us if we've done a better job in trying to address these issues on age. It's almost 8 o'clock, so I just want to very quickly, thank you again, Kunal, for a really great paper and such an interesting, a really thought-provoking paper, because government jobs are such an important part of at least the mind of so many people entering the labor market in India. And as Christina said, you're really humble in talking down the size of the effects that you're seeing. I mean, these are really big things that you're picking up. And I think from CMI, we're glad that we could help you in doing some of this research. I just want to turn it back to you and Christina really quickly. Is there anything you'd like to say? And then I'll bring the session to a close.
No, I don't have anything else. I'm just thanks for the opportunity. I hope other people who are interested, get in touch with me. I hope that more people work on this type of questions. There's a lot of work to be done. So
great, thank you. We'll make sure you get a list of all of the people that came to today's talk and the questions, and you can take time in responding to them later as well. Audience members, thanks so much for sticking around. If any of you would like to get in touch with Kunal, please just get in touch with us if you can't find his email address, but it should be fairly easy, and we'll be happy to introduce you. Christina, thank you for sparing the time. I know what a difficult day it's been today for you already. So thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. And we'll talk to all of you again soon.